Hi there. I'm not sure if it's Steffan or Stefan, so you have to forgive me if I got it wrong. So I'm going to go with Steffan, just because I think that's the closest thing I have is a friend named Steffan. But correct me if I'm wrong. Just let me know. I want to make sure that we get this right. So I wanted to create this video just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm thinking about as I'm looking at your posts and how I check to see if we went up if we covered all of the things that the discussion was really asking us to cover. Based on your name, you were asked to choose one of the three resources, and you have the oceans. And you're right. There's definitely a lot of policy going on in Alaska because it's surrounded by oceans. So looking at the first part of the post, what I'm not really sure about is the values, and it's because the discussion was specifically asking you to discuss the various direct and indirect environmental values that are associated with the natural resource. And we have, you have some things that you're talking about, like, for example, the resource oil, and you're talking about over here the wildlife. So what we really want to do is understand why these things are valued, and to do that, you really have to look at your textbook. There's no other way around it. I mean, just in chapter 1, there's this great table, and this table, in just at a glance, really goes over what the values are. They're right here on the top. So when we talk about oil basically has utilitarian value or use value because it has a market price. We use oil, it costs $40 a barrel. That one's pretty easy. And some of the other things like wildlife from the oceans or sea life. Why do we value sea life? Well, you might look down this and say that, well, we have fisheries. In Alaska, that's a big deal. Fisheries create a lot of money. So the oceans support fisheries, and the fishery has a utilitarian value or use value. As some of the other people in your class have mentioned, there's also ecosystem services that are provided by the oceans, like the creation of oxygen and regulating weather. Those are actually indirect values, like your text says. Then some of these other ones, like what about the ocean? What's another thing about the ocean? Well, the aesthetic value. It has visual appeal and recreational and scenic appeal. Just think of all of the recreational opportunities that the ocean provides. That's something that is of value to us. So when talking about environmental values, I really strongly urge everybody to just look at this one small piece of chapter 1, because it goes over the types of values and it goes over how to understand those. You could go to the case study, but it's really only a couple paragraphs. This is about it right here. But you have to know this because in week 2, you're going to be asked to talk about environmental values and a specific resource, and on the final paper, you're going to be asked to talk about environmental values and a specific resource. And the problem is, if you don't understand environmental values, then you have no idea why politicians value the resource and why voters value the resource. So without the understanding of why people care, you don't really have an understanding of why a politician would make a policy. Politicians are always going to make a policy to appeal to the voters. And if the voters value something, you can bet your buns that the politician is going to create policies to support whatever that resource is. So by understanding how these different types of values work, we'll understand why they're important to the policy-making process. So be sure to take a look at that. So some of the other things that were supposed to be discussed were policy tensions and global warming, fishing, the oil industry. All of these things are sort of at odds because they do have competing values. Offshore drilling and the fishing industry in Alaska, fossil fuel shipping and the tourism industry are both at odds. So, policy tensions might be surrounding something like offshore drilling. And on one side, you're going to have people that are against it because it could potentially damage fisheries or damage recreational opportunities. And on the other hand, you have the energy industry who's all for it. And you can kind of look at the local politicians to see what political parties are for or against a particular policy. And that helps you to identify what the tension is. The tension in the case of fisheries versus fossil fuels is basically, it's all about money, really. One group is going to get money one way, one group's going to get it the other. And in the end, at the end of the day, the politician's going to make a policy that supports the group that not only makes the most money and donates to their campaigns, but that also has the most support from voters. And if you have 1,000 people working in the oil industry, that's 1,000 votes. If you have 100 people working in the fishing industry, guess which interest is going to win? Well, obviously the one with the most votes and the most jobs. So think about that. The worldviews. This is really it's really simple. I mean, you kind of touch on it, but what we really want to get to is, like, you can look at the world one of two ways. You can either put people first, or you could put the environment first. And putting the environment first means it's a biocentric point of view. The Endangered Species Act is a very biocentric policy. It doesn't really matter what people have going on. It doesn't matter if it costs people jobs. It doesn't matter if it slows development. It's only important to make sure that these endangered species are not harmed in some way. So that's very biocentric. And anthropocentric, people might say that the Clean Air Act actually puts humans first and human health. Like, without human health being an issue, we might not have the Clean Air Act. So just one more final note on scholarly support. Like, I think the textbook is always appropriate to use, but you kind of have to be careful when you look at the internet and look at groups like this one that you were citing. Because this is essentially a charity, and it's a charity that collects money and supports activism, but they're not producing any sorts of reports or scholarly support. So, I looked through this page, and they have some very basic information, and they're asking for donations, and they claim to support other nonprofits. But if you're looking at nonprofits, they need to be centered on policy. And while there's plenty of nonprofits that support causes, they're not really appropriate as scholarly resources unless they're doing scholarly analysis and putting out reports and analyzing data. So I would really suggest selecting resources from this big list in the course materials. All of these required resources are perfect for, or as far as scholarly references are concerned. When we get into the next week and you have to write a paper on the Clean Air Act, this resource by Power, the Clean Water Act, this one by Mertens, all these are readily available to you, and they're pretty easy to read as far as scholarly papers go. Like, here's one. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change puts out a report, and when you talk about climate change, this is a really, really good reference, because as you'll see, it's not like a lot of the APA formatted papers that you find in the library. This one is actually pretty nice. It has pictures, it has an executive summary, it has details, charts, all of the types of things that make it easy to read and understand. So try to find scholarly resources that fit more into that category rather than the ones that you can find on the internet. Like this one, the Alaska Marine Conservation Council. Probably a great organization and probably very active politically, but not great scholarly. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So getting back to your post, I just want to conclude with, that it's a good post and you did a nice job, and I appreciate the things that you have to say about the oceans. I was a fisherman in Alaska for several years, so I think more than a lot of people, I can appreciate what's going on and how important the ocean is to all the people in that community. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Bye.